Orders of the day.
Resumption of debate on the question that the budget papers and appropriation bills number 1 and 2, 2025, be noted. Ms Webb.
Honourable Member for Nelson. Unless the Honourable Member for Nelson makes her way to the floor, I'd like to welcome the second group from the Launceston Preparatory School who are touring Parliament today. We've just completed our question time, and that's where members of the Legislative Council ask questions of the government or ministers, and we've done that for half an hour. So now we're going into orders of the day, and honourable members of the Legislative Council are making contributions about the recent state budget. So that's the flavour of our debate, and it's the Honourable Member for Nelson's turn to speak, and I'm sure the Honourable Member for Nelson, along with all other members in the chamber, will make you welcome to our chamber and thank you for visiting the Parliament of Tasmania. Honourable Member for Nelson.
Indeed, Mr President, we do all welcome them. Mr President, I was speaking about the government's decision to rely almost exclusively on cutting spending with minimal focus, if any, on investigating additional or alternative revenue sources. And this is despite the Treasurer's speech on the budget stating, and I quote, just 1% change in the GST pool of Tasmania's relativity could result in revenue shifts of about $38 million to $20 million respectively. End of quote. With further warnings delivered that the consequences of any such shift are very real. The Treasurer then went on to say the following, and I quote, "Our fiscal strategy seeks to maintain a stable and diversified revenue base, ensuring that temporary fluctuations in one source, particularly federal government funding, do not undermine the delivery of essential services." So there we have it, Mr President, a recognition of the need for a fiscal strategy focused on maintaining a stable and diversified revenue base. Imagine my surprise to hear the Treasurer on ABC Mornings Radio last Friday, the day after the budget was delivered, be dismissive of any talk of enhancing or diversifying locally raised income by stating, and again I quote from that radio interview, he said, "Even if the government were to increase taxes by 10% across the board, it would represent a 3% increase in revenue. That is marginal at best." End of quote. This statement infers that 3% is somehow not worth the effort, Mr President. But let's be clear then about what is not worth the effort. As the Treasurer's speech details, the total revenue for the general government sector for 2025-26 is estimated to be $9.5 billion. 3% of $9.5 billion is approximately $284.9 million. Remember, the Treasurer's own speech warned that even a 1% fluctuation in GST revenue presents real consequences. Therefore, surely a potential 3% increase in revenue could make as equally a real difference. Just to be clear, Mr President, be very clear, I'm not advocating blindly for a blanket 10% increase across our current state taxes, and I hope my discussion point in this sense is not maliciously misrepresented somewhere else. Instead, I'm illustrating that if the state puts in the work and truly examined if our revenue base is sufficiently modern, equitable and diversified, even a small but sustainable revenue increase of a few percent can make a significant difference. Try telling those young people still being abused at AYDC because it remains open and in use, contrary to the Commission of Inquiry's explicit recommendation it be closed immediately. Try telling them that the potential foregone, say $284 million, is not worth the effort. Or try telling the TAFE lab tech students and teachers who are seeing that invaluable course be priced out of existence, that potential income is not worth the effort to achieve. Or try telling the TAFE arts and creative industries students and teachers also facing extinction on dubious prioritisation grounds, seeing their accessible subsidies dry up virtually overnight. That would be a pittance in a small increase of our revenue. Or the Tasmanian National Preventative Mechanism, Mr President, a responsibility under our OPCAT legislation, who has issued repeated warnings it cannot meet its statutory obligations due to being critically underfunded and resourced. Or our invaluable neighbourhood houses around the state, particularly I'm going to mention my Kingston neighbourhood house in my electorate, which delivers crucial services and provides important avenues for community connection and social inclusion, but which is struggling to maintain essential facilities, Mr President. And the list could go on and on and on. And of course, we can't do all of those things, but significant things can be done even with a small percentage increase in our own revenue sources in this state. Mr President, as Saul Estlake recently commented on the interim budget, and I quote this from him: "If the government had actually made a start on a combination of revenue and expenditure measures in today's interim budget, there would have been a better chance that the fruits of doing so, in terms of a more credible and sustainable trajectory for the key budget numbers presented in today's budget papers, would become apparent before the next election, whenever that might be. In particular, whilst acknowledging that raising taxes is an especially difficult choice for a Liberal government, there would have been more time to explain the need for such choices to the electorate, and perhaps a greater opportunity to foreshadow some tax relief at the next election by getting Tasmania's finances on a more sustainable footing before then. These opportunities and others have been foregone." End of quote. To reiterate, Mr President, meaningful fiscal structural reform and budget repair requires both revenue and expenditure to be seriously and equitably reviewed and addressed. This is more than just a missed opportunity in my book, Mr President. It's an irresponsible refusal to seize the opportunity. This power-sharing parliament is potentially the best chance in decades to attempt to break the bipartisan fiscal structural reform inertia and to put paid to the inevitable childish who will blink first when it comes to modernising and diversifying our state taxation and revenue base. As Mr Estlake said, those opportunities and others have been foregone. And it is the Tasmanian people, Mr President, particularly the most vulnerable among us, who are going to pay the price big time. Mr President, I previously mentioned our recent discussions in this place regarding how to improve Parliament's scrutiny and input of the Executive when it comes to financial management and budget. Given the Treasurer referred to his multi-party panel during his budget speech, I think it's appropriate to canvass other and more inclusive options for consideration in this response I'm giving today. Some members here may recall that once upon a time this Parliament used to have another joint committee, the Working Arrangements Committee. The principal role of that committee was to examine and recommend to both houses measures which may improve the performance and efficiency of the Parliament. That committee provided a transparent, accountable mechanism by which proposals to improve parliamentary workings were discussed, including breaking any legislative deadlocks between the two chambers, for example. Advice from stakeholders was sought to inform those discussions and recommendations made and reported to Parliament for consideration. As an example of the fruits of that committee, in 1998, that committee tabled a report reviewing and recommending the permanent establishment of government business enterprise scrutiny committees, something that hadn't been present before, Mr President, and now is a part of our architecture of scrutiny here. I think it would be a very useful move for this Parliament to consider reconvening something like the Working Arrangements of Parliament Joint Committee, particularly to then examine the most appropriate and effective mechanisms available to our Westminster Parliament to have input into and scrutinise fiscal and budgetary decisions made by the government of the day. It would be an appropriate parliamentary mechanism. For example, I'd like to see such a committee examine the proposal that I've spoken about at various times, that we could look at how to better improve our estimates processes. Mr President, I like the idea and think it should be examined for value of having two sets of estimates sessions annually, for example. One set of estimates linked to the state budget, focused narrowly on budget numbers and fiscal indicators, and at a separate time to occur after the tabling of departmental annual reports, another set of estimates specifically focusing on examining policy positions, indicators and outcomes as reflected in those annual reports. That's a model that has been adopted in New Zealand, for example, and it would be worth considering, I think, its appropriateness for our jurisdiction, Mr President. It would give us two chances to scrutinise the government, both on their investment through the budget, but also on their policy outcomes that are being delivered and reported in annual reports. It's just an idea. My point is we should be setting up a mechanism that we can look at and examine a range of ideas about how we can strengthen our scrutiny in this place and be very active in doing so. I would hope to participate in that sort of process, certainly putting forward ideas for consideration. Even as a more straightforward first step, in relation to our current arrangements, I would argue that in the interests of more effective scrutiny, there's a case for each House to have separately scheduled budget estimate scrutiny hearings on successive weeks rather than have them held concurrently. I'm convinced that we should be looking at the scope and the powers also of our existing committees, especially our joint standing and sessional committees, and asking ourselves how they may be improved in their operation and the strength and breadth of what they do potentially. Mr President, one of our jobs here is to be considering how we can better undertake our key role of scrutiny of the executive on behalf of the Tasmanian people. Mechanisms for that consideration should be built into our parliamentary structures and should be an active matter of interest and endeavour for all members. I hope that in this place we see a further and ongoing active consideration of opportunities to improve our capacity for effective scrutiny. Something to add here, Mr President, actually is just to note the purpose of our scrutiny. It's not to be shouting into a void. We actually need an informed electorate. So at crunch time, when a government presents itself for re-election, an informed and educated citizenry can be making decisions about how well that government's done and whether they want to vote them back in or not. It's our job here to be constantly providing information and bringing it into the public domain so that the community can have the information they need to make that decision when they vote. So our scrutiny has a purpose that's beyond just what happens in this place, but ripples out to the community to help our democracy function in the way it should, so voters can hold governments to account ultimately at the ballot box when they're placing their vote. And that decision should be made on an informed assessment by the voter of how well the government has delivered on its mandate as an executive. Mr President, to move on from those potential budgetary oversight reforms and ways that we can think about improving our scrutiny, I'd now like to focus on some key areas that I regard as important to highlight in relation to our state budget. And Mr President, I am going to go to speak about things that I do typically talk about in terms of a normal budget, because just because this is an interim budget, as called by the Treasurer, doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at it as thoroughly as we would a normal budget, in inverted commas. So, Mr President, a policy area that I regularly speak about in relation to the state budget is that of housing and homelessness. I do that because having a secure, affordable, long-term home is the essential basis to a decent life. The lack of that is not only what is holding so many Tasmanians back, it's holding our whole state back, and it will be a brake on budget repair. I believe all members here will have received Anglicare's quarterly housing report for the July to September quarter this year. That report is grim reading. It tells us that there's been a 34% increase in the number of Tasmanians seeking housing support from the Housing Connect front door in that quarter. There's been an 88% increase in the number of people sleeping rough. There's been a 54% increase in people living in inadequate or substandard dwellings. Strikingly, it states that some Tasmanians are living in conditions more commonly seen in developing countries. For example, substandard dwellings including sheds without running water, bathroom facilities or kitchens. The report speaks to the fact that the number of children in families seeking housing support has grown by 60%, Mr President. These are really striking and disturbing numbers. Increases of 88% for sleeping rough, 54% for inadequate and substandard dwellings, and 60% increase in the number of children in families seeking support. This is desperation, Mr President. All the government does in response to these sorts of grim tidings from the sector is parrot a line that people should contact Housing Connect front door and she'll be right, as if that's some sort of solution or end in itself, and we know full well it's not, Mr President. And while the Housing Connect staff, who I have the utmost respect for because they provide a caring and supporting service and they're professional about doing it, they simply are not able to offer what most clients presenting to them need: a secure and stable, affordable home. We've had 11 years of failure from this government on providing that most basic need to its citizens. SARC modelling, the Social Action and Research Centre at Anglicare modelling suggests that we will see approximately 14,000 Tasmanians waiting for social housing by 2032. That's not very far down the track, Mr President. It's 7 years from now. 7 years ago we were in 2018, that's not very far behind us, so 2032 is not very far ahead of us, and 14,000 Tasmanians projected to be on the social housing waiting list by that time, and that's calculating in the government's little litany of things that they're apparently attempting to do in this space. So many people So many people are being driven onto that list, the social housing waiting list, because they're falling out of the private rental market, Mr President. As this housing crisis, which is what we called it in 2018, but it's now grown to a life-defining emergency in this state in 2025. The private rental market is the housing tenure the government has utterly neglected neglected to act on in any meaningful way. Our private rental market is in catastrophic market failure, and as Anglicare plainly says in its report, government intervention is urgently needed. With the critically low vacancy rates across the state, largely it's below 1%, well below 1%, and no meaningful break is able to be applied to rent increases in this state. We see rents outpacing wages by at least 15%. It's virtually impossible for a young adult to move out of home in this state into a rental property, even a share house. It is impossible for a person or a family on welfare support to rent affordably in this state if they're trying to enter the private rental market. People who are fortunate enough to be in rentals already are terrified they will be evicted at the end of their current lease, which can happen without any reason at all, because we have failed to keep up with contemporary practice and prevent no-fault evictions like every other state has. This terror stops tenants making maintenance requests or raising issues that might put them on their landlord's radar for eviction at the end of the lease. And while we recently passed in this place the pets in rental legislation, which on paper expands the rights of tenants when it comes to having a pet, in the context of catastrophic market failure in the private rental market, all tenants' rights become much harder to assert and protect. The Anglicare report asks the question, do we have the right response to reality? And Mr President, the answer has to be a resounding no. Indicators are all going in the wrong direction. We are running away from reality here, and that's to the detriment of the most vulnerable amongst us in our community. Mr President, housing is a foundation to all other aspects of a good life: health, education, family, community participation, employment, and on and on. The Liberal government's failure on housing, the challenges are greater. Because of the Liberal government's failure on housing, the challenges are greater and the costs are higher in our health system, in our education system, in our community services system, and in our criminal justice system. The government response to this sort of assertion being made or put before them is to simply give us a laundry list of things that they're doing in the housing space. And that's just meaningless, Mr President. It's utterly meaningless. It's not delivering the results. Half-hearted efforts like the Family Violence Rapid Rehousing Program and the Private Rental Incentive Scheme have failed to make any tangible difference. They have not achieved the outcomes needed. They are at best busy work from this government, not solutions. Mr President, the data doesn't lie. This is a situation that has radically deteriorated under their watch. It is this Liberal government's failure and it is their responsibility. The story has always been the same when it comes to housing. The government can do more and they aren't.
Choose not to.
That's exactly right. Not only are we not building enough housing of all tenure types, but importantly, the government are pulling none of the levers that would make a palpable difference in the private rental market. No doubt, Mr President, the siloed approach contributes to this because we have our Residential Tenancy Act, the primary legislation to address matters in the private rental market, under the responsibility of a different minister to the Minister for Housing and Homelessness, whose portfolio is feeling the most ferocious effects of the failure to act on private rental market reform. We need to comprehensively reform our Residential Tenancy Act and, as key priorities, deliver stronger guardrails on rent increases and, like every other state, get rid of no-fault evictions at the end of leases. The continued failure to address these two things has been a key driver of the massive increase in homelessness in Tasmania over the terms of this Liberal government. We also need to address the decimation of our private rental market by short stay accommodation with meaningful regulation and controls at a local government level. We see this government's failure writ large in the relentless rise in the number of Tasmanians on the waiting list for social and public housing. Every single one of those applicants is an indictment on this government. Homes Tasmania is looking more and more like a failed experiment. It has confirmed the fears that were stated when the legislation came through this place to form it, that it would be less effective to take the responsibilities out of a government department and would be an exercise in keeping accountability at arm's length. The damning review of Homes Tasmania released in June is an admission that it isn't working as planned, and already we've seen strategic housing policy shifted back into DSG. Mr. President, another area of particular interest and concern to me is the implementation of the Commission of Inquiry recommendations. And in speaking on this topic here today, I'm going to note that today is National Survivors' Day, the 12th of November. This day recognises and commemorates the courage and journeys of survivors of sexual assault and institutional abuse, their supporters and whistleblowers across Australia. In that spirit, I want to state here my acknowledgement of those who are victim survivors of sexual assault and institutional abuse, and those whistleblowers who have tirelessly and at great personal cost fought to see the truth brought to light. In particular, I honour those who, through their courage and commitment, caused the Commission of Inquiry to be established and whose contributions made that Commission of Inquiry such a watershed moment in our state. Mr. President, the implementation of recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry is an ongoing piece of work and one that is occupying a great deal of time and attention across various departments, and rightly so. I do want to take the opportunity also here to acknowledge that there are many, many public servants across those departments who are working with care and conviction to deliver on both the letter and the spirit of the Commission of Inquiry recommendations. This is complex work, and when coupled with the significant cultural change that has been identified as necessary to bring about real improvement in the safety of children in our state, it is a mountain that we are all climbing together. Thank you to those public servants who are driving and contributing to this shared task. Mr. President, to speak in some detail on some matters from the budget in relation to the implementation of Commission of Inquiry recommendations, I'll just mention a few here that I'd like to put on the record. I do note that there is, I believe, $15.8 million over 4 years for independent statutory bodies like the Commission for Children and Young People, the Office of the Independent Regulator and the Office of the Independent Monitor. These are really, it's very positive to have oversight bodies in place as a result of these recommendations. It's crucial for ensuring that the recommendations are implemented and are effectively working to deliver the outcome of greater safety for Tasmanian children. I do have to ask, though, and we will explore in more detail next week, no doubt, during estimates, is the funding allocated enough for them to undertake their statutory roles? We do have a habit in this state, Mr. President, from this government of underfunding oversight entities. So that's something to be interrogated carefully. I note that there's $500,000, I believe, for the Office of the Tasmanian MPM under our OPCAT obligations. I am yet to understand whether this is going to be enough to provide for them to actually do their job this time around, Mr. President. Certainly in May, they weren't provided with sufficient funding to actually do their role, just enough funding to exist on paper. Mr. President, I note that there's $155.3 million, I believe, allocated for the new youth detention facility at Pontville. This is such a controversial project, of course. We've spoken here a lot, and I'm not going to dwell on it in detail today, but we do need to be closing AYDC as a matter of urgency. It was a matter of urgency 2 years ago when the Commission of Inquiry brought down their final report. It remains a matter of urgency now, and we are 2 years down the track. It's still not clear what the new youth detention facility at Pontville's final cost will be, I don't believe. It is going through the planning system, which is positive in terms of progress. There are still significant criticisms about the model of care. It's certainly a different facility and model of care to what was outlined in the Commission of Inquiry recommendations, and so more needs to be unpicked in that space. And I am concerned, Mr. President, that with the brutal cuts that we've had foreshadowed that must come in the next state budget and onwards under this government's approach to budget repair, I am quite afraid that we will see savings, and I say that with inverted commas, savings made in the way the new facility is put in place and developed and then operated. And that would be absolutely tragic to see. It would undermine the whole intent of a new model of youth detention and the therapeutic approach it's supposed to be taking. So that's absolutely to be examined with eagle eyes and a continued very active watching brief in that space. And I'm pleased that we have a committee that's tasked with particularly scrutinising these recommendations as they're rolled out. I also note in the budget $4 million to support community youth justice, including $1.5 million over 2 years to support new local place-based initiatives targeting the root causes of youth offending. That's really positive. It's very optimistic, I think, to focus on preventative measures in the community. It's what we need. My concern is that we must ensure that the investments made in services and supports that are evidence-based and accountable and don't present risks in and of themselves. So I'll be very carefully looking at the intention of how that money is to be spent. I was pleased at least not to see more irresponsible election promises made about funding into this space in the most recent election, Mr President. As we've seen in elections past, this is an area of public policy that should never be the subject of reckless election commitments and promises. It is always something that should be approached with absolute rigour and services designed, developed, tendered and then appointed through an absolutely rigorous process to get us the best services for the best outcomes, for the most accountability and greatest safety of our children. Mr President, I note too out-of-home care and foster and kinship carers have had some uplift in this budget. That's very positive. I am concerned though, and I know we had some discussion just in our question time today, about the uplift for foster and kinship carers. It's for 1 year, recognising that there's a process underway to more comprehensively assess where to from here in terms of support for foster and kinship carers, which is great to have that review process. But I think the assumption would have to be, Mr President, that it is going to tell us we need to pay them more than they're currently being paid. So while the budget does indicate the 1 year uplift while the review happens, the fact that there's nothing in the forward estimates is just a little device to make the budget look better in the forward estimates, because we do have to assume there will be more funding needed in this space across those forward estimates as a result of the review. Otherwise, the government's basically admitting, no, it's 1 year, it's a 1 year 15% boost, and then we just go back to what we were doing before. Mr President, I do note, I was surprised really and wondered about the particular mention in the budget papers about the intensive family engagement service. Of course, it is an important part of our child safety service. It provides support for families who are assessed as experiencing complex issues that directly impact on the safety of children. And the budget points to funding of $4 million a year for 2 years, which is apparently to continue the IFES services up to 88 packages. And again, I'm not sure why it's detailed there, if this is new funding or not. We'll dig into that in estimates. It looks to me like it's a continuation of existing funding, but again, in the forward estimates, nothing. 2 years worth of funding and then blank across the out years of the forward estimates. So I don't understand in the first place why it's an announcement to be funding that service, which is already funded. It doesn't seem to be that it's new funding or even necessarily additional funding. And it certainly drops away in the forward estimates just so we get that better looking bottom line in year 3 and 4. So that's one for looking at, Mr President. One of the things that I always look to after a budget is the comments that are provided by the representative bodies in different spaces of policy. And so I did look at the Why Not budget comments, the Youth Network of Tasmania, and I'm just going to read a quote from the comments they made about this budget after it had been brought down last week. This is what Why Not partly said in their statement. We welcome the continued investment in implementing the Commission of Inquiry recommendations, including the establishment of the new Commission for Children and Young People, the Office of the Implementation Monitor and the funding of out-of-home care and youth justice initiatives. And it goes on to say, Mr President, of particular concern in the budget papers is the consolidation of funding for the delivery of the Commission of Inquiry recommendations and the Child and Youth Wellbeing Strategy. Without transparent allocation of these funds, it remains unclear how the government intends to meet its policy commitments to young Tasmanians. Why Not will be actively seeking clarification on these budget allocations to ensure that promises translate into real outcomes. End of quote. I will certainly be endeavouring to assist Why Not in that task of trying to make sense of these allocations and look for transparency that at the moment isn't apparent. Mr President, I'm always going to have a keen interest in the health and sustainability of our community services industry in Tasmania. This is the industry I worked in prior to coming to this place, and it remains close to my heart. I hold it dear not just out of a sense of nostalgia, though, Mr President, but because I'm acutely aware of how fundamentally important it is to our state. This industry, the community services industry, is the glue that holds our communities and our state together. The viability of this industry is a key determinant of health, employment and social cohesion across our state. Mr President, I think it's useful to have a clear picture of this industry and the magnitude of the task it faces, given the vastly inadequate funding it receives. This industry has 28,000 workers, Mr President. The community service industry is a huge employer in our state. It is doing work to support our community, and some of the challenges that it is endeavouring to assist us with in this state and to solve the issues of include the fact that 81,500 Tasmanians, I'll just say that again, Mr President, 81,500 Tasmanians are living below the poverty line. 14% of us, Mr President. This has risen 16% in 2 years. We also have 50,000 Tasmanians experiencing energy poverty. 1 in 3 Tasmanian households are food insecure. There are now an absolute record of 5,336 applicants on the priority social housing waitlist in September this year. And the average wait times for those applicants is more than 18 months. We've had the sector note a 34% rise in people seeking housing support and an 88% rise in rough sleeping just in this last quarter's report. Mr President, these are desperate numbers, and it is our community services industry that are the ones that are on the front line of addressing these needs and these challenges for us. The community services industry, Mr President, went into this budget and the election that preceded it with some really basic funding asks. It was seeking to be supported in this budget by having funding certainty provided through 5-year contracts, appropriate indexation and outcomes-based frameworks around funding. They were looking for an industry sustainability program with standard contracts, reduced reporting, streamlined processes and shared services. They were looking for a 10-year update, funding for a 10-year update of the State of Tasmania's Community Services Industry Report. And they were also looking for a mid-term review of the Community Services Industry Plan 2021 to 31. That's what they went into the budget asking. It's pretty modest, actually, for a peak body of the industry that employs 28,000 workers in this state and faces the challenges that I've just described on our behalf. What did they get out of the budget, Mr President? The key announcement that related to this industry, after having those very modest and basic funding asks presented, the key announcement for the community service industry was $150,000 for a community services sustainability initiative. $150,000 for a sustainability initiative. None of those other things were delivered on effectively for this industry, for our state. That's just shameful, Mr President. It's just, I use that word a lot, and it probably loses its potency in overuse, Mr President, but I just can't think of another way to describe it, actually. These are people who are working on the front line. These are people who go above and beyond every single day with people who are in the most desperate of circumstances. And often it's a great personal cost to the 28,000 workers in this industry, actually. And they have basically been given a slap in the face through this budget. And we're looking ahead to horror in the next one coming. Tascos has said in response to Thursday's budget, said this: "We remain concerned at the level of debt we are taking on to fund infrastructure projects that could be deferred and the impact this has on the amount of funding available to deliver essential services to Tasmanians. Community services represent a small fraction of the state's total budget, but this investment prevents the need for higher expenditure across other portfolios such as health, justice and education. As we look to the budget next year, we urge the Treasurer to take a balanced approach to budget repair by considering a mix of revenue raising and targeted investment that prevents costly crises, not through cuts that guarantee them. Community services are not a nice to have, government expenditure should be prioritised to delivering essential services and supports to Tasmanians that will enable them to fully participate in our economy. End of quote, Mr President. Mr President, the community sector is already underfunded, with demand for support far outstripping what can be delivered by service providers. This is an industry already going above and beyond what they're funded to provide. It is guaranteed, absolute, rock-solid, guaranteed, that cuts to other service areas, whether that's health, education, criminal justice, whatever we choose to cut, it will drive demand into our community services sector. That means that any cuts directly to the community services sector in coming budgets will be a false economy, Mr President, because this is a sector we'll need more in the future, not less. Now is the time for greater investment, not cuts, to the community services industry. Cuts will inevitably mean that the first things jettisoned will be long-term prevention and early intervention programs. Those are what will be neglected. For example, in the area of family and sexual violence services and support, I did note the Tasmanian Family and Sexual Violence Alliance said that the interim budget does not meet the scale of the state's family and sexual violence crisis being experienced. They're warning that rising demand, growing wait lists and stagnant investment continue to leave women and children unsafe. In comments on the budget, the Tasmanian Family and Sexual Violence Alliance said this, and I'll quote. It's a longish quote, Mr President, and I want it here on the record because it explains how, by failing to sufficiently fund particularly prevention services, we are digging a hole for ourselves that is just horrific. The quote from the Alliance is this: reports of family violence have risen by nearly 70% over the past 5 years and sexual violence by 180%. Yet funding to specialist support services has not shifted to match that demand. This budget doesn't meet the scale of the crisis. We're seeing demand rising and funding for specialist family and sexual violence services flat. Women and children are waiting months, sometimes years, for support. Our frontline family violence services report women are having to wait far too long. Sexual violence services report significant wait times for survivors to access much-needed trauma counselling, including victim survivors of child sexual abuse. Women experiencing family and sexual violence are increasingly self-representing in court because they cannot access specialist legal services. We are also hearing from the sector that critical investment is needed in services to support children and young people impacted by family violence, in programs that educate children on respectful relationships, along with dedicated support for Aboriginal women and investment in dedicated housing, including crisis accommodation, transition and long-term homes. This must be met with a sustainable and skilled workforce to meet rising demand. Tasmania has the chance to prevent harm and reduce demand, but that requires sustained investment, not only short-term crisis responses. Every Tasmanian deserves to live safely and with dignity and agency. End of quote. Mr President, this budget, and looking ahead to the next budget and the measures foreshadowed to be in it, we can see that those punished most severely will be Tasmanians doing it most tough. We all know the essential services, supports and community building done by neighbourhood houses in our local communities. Those same essential community supports are at risk, with the peak body Neighbourhood Houses Tasmania commenting on this budget. I quote, the Tasmanian Government has maintained the same level of funding for neighbourhood houses in this budget, but this level of funding is not safe or sustainable. Neighbourhood houses are resilient but have their limits. Our houses, people and volunteers are being stretched to breaking point. We continue to work with government to find solutions to ensure Tasmanians don't lose an essential community infrastructure. Neighbourhood houses are the trusted local hubs at the heart of Tasmanian communities, open to everyone, always. Every week they provide connection, learning and vital support to over 28,000 Tasmanians. End of quote, Mr President. We are taking our neighbourhood houses in this state for granted, Mr President. This budget takes our neighbourhood houses for granted. Politicians love nothing more than to turn up at neighbourhood houses for a feel-good photo op to pop onto the socials, but when it comes to funding from this government, they get scraps and window dressing. We've got neighbourhood houses closing services in all areas of our state. In some cases, they're falling apart at the seams. The Kingston Neighbourhood House in my patch, which leaks through the light fittings when it rains, Mr President, and has to send staff home. This is the way we are taking our neighbourhood houses for granted. It's not good enough, Mr President, and importantly, because we're talking about the budget, it's false economy to be underfunding these supports in our community. Mr President, this has been described by TASCOS as a treading water budget. My fear, though, Mr President, for the community sector is that it will be treading water in shark-infested oceans with an armada of fins coming towards them in the May 2026 state budget. I fear for the result in our communities. Mr President, moving on, I take this opportunity once again to restate my very firm position that the Premier of this state should hold the Aboriginal Affairs portfolio. Reconciliation with the traditional owners of Lutruwita, this island home, should be an ongoing top priority as a state and as a community. It requires the gravitas of the elected leader of the state in the form of the Premier to take on that responsibility. I do not understand the reasoning behind removing Aboriginal Affairs from DPAC when it was shifted in November 2024 to the Department of Natural Resources and Environment Tasmania. That sent a bad message, I believe, Mr President. While I welcome the commitment to establish a Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, as was recommended by the Commission of Inquiry, we have learned the hard way here that it will take continual vigilance to ensure the new Commissioner is adequately resourced and empowered to fulfil its role. Further, I note that the budget papers pronounce the increase of funding to a select few important Aboriginal heritage programs and also the long-awaited funding for the Aboriginal Land Council of Tasmania that it requires to ensure that that entity can fulfil its mandated core administrative obligations, all of which are welcome and necessary. However, in Table 9.2 of Budget Paper Number 2, Volume 1, which shows that the Output Group 6's initial increase for 25-26 then drops away over the forward estimates, Mr President. We've got a familiar song we're singing here. An initial bit of funding in this budget and perhaps for the following year, and then nothing in the forward estimates. What are we to interpret by that, Mr President? Is suddenly the need to do basic administration by, say, the Aboriginal Land Council going to fall away in Year 3 and 4 of this budget? Not likely. We're either going to be cutting them to ribbons then with a drop in funding, or we're going to be putting more money into the budget. No wonder we're not wanting to put it there now, Mr President, because that would disrupt the very misleading narrative that the Treasurer is trying to paint about a pathway, a glide pathway, apparently, to better times. It's a grave concern to see a similar drop-off in funding over the forward estimates for the Closing the Gap and other Aboriginal projects, which is detailed in Table 11.1 of Budget Paper Number 2, Volume 1. I'm deeply uncomfortable, actually, Mr President, with the clustering of the Closing the Gap, which I regard as a fundamental human rights delivery program and an obligation on our state. The clustering of that with a line item summarised as other Aboriginal projects. It's arguable that the government, genuine about turning around its current poor track record on meeting Closing the Gap obligations, would have a separate line item or even an output group dedicated to Closing the Gap. I recognise that not all benchmark obligations will translate into a financial or budgetary representation, but it would help this Parliament and the community to track exactly what the government is investing in Closing the Gap, if it was in fact in its own line item. Currently, the fact it's rolled into a line item consisting of other Aboriginal projects conveniently muddies, I think, those financial waters. However, the decrease in funding over the forward estimates for that particular line item raises concerns that the Closing the Gap funding is set to decrease. That's the only thing we can interpret from that, Mr President. An absence of funding in Year 3 and 4. How on earth can the government even pretend it's trying to turn around our shameful failure to meet those agreed Closing the Gap obligations? And the other inconvenient truth, which I refuse to allow the government to conveniently forget, is the commitment it made to progressing truth-telling and treaty. Mr President, this has to happen. It will happen eventually. The 2021 Pathway to Truth-Telling and Treaty report should be a fixture in our annual budgets until its 24 recommendations are implemented and the treaty is signed and delivered. Imagine how far some additional raised revenue, even a portion of the hypothetical 3% the Treasurer was so scornful about on radio, could make if it was invested in the delivery of the Pathway to Truth-Telling and Treaty Report recommendations. It will be the government's decision as to which side of history it will find itself on. Sadly, from a position where it could have been a historic leader in genuine reconciliation, truth-telling and treaty, instead this government has now slunk into the shadows of spineless ignominy. Mr. President, it's very telling that the week we see many political and community leaders heading to COP30 in Brazil, when international scientific and climate experts are warning of dire consequences should we fail to meet the climate challenge, we see significant cuts made to our climate change funding in this budget. It appears the Output Group 7.2 in Budget Paper Number 2, Volume 1, climate change suffers a decrease, it would appear, of $411,000 for the 2025-26 year, and then a further funding cut of 29% in the forward estimates for 2026-27. But the paucity of detail here in the budget makes it unclear as to what impact these cuts will have or what exactly they're going to be doing. What does that mean for the Climate Change Office, for example? The 2024-25 statutory independent review of the Climate Change State Action Act 2008 is currently underway, with its final report expected by the end of this year. It would appear from these budget papers the government is either not expecting recommendations which have any degree of financial component, or the government does not intend to implement any recommendations made by the independent review. Again, we're seeing the false juxtaposition of the green economy and climate ambition versus economic growth. In contrast, recent analysis from the OECD and the UN Development Programme shows that stepping up and engaging consistently with public and private sectors and communities strengthens rather than weakens economic growth and prosperity. We should be acting on climate change, Mr. President. It will be to our financial detriment ultimately that we don't. Climate action is not just about setting higher emissions targets, or lower emissions targets, that probably should read, shouldn't it? I don't know. Higher emissions reductions. There you go. But also about weaving that necessary transition to all our economic and social strategies. This means aligning climate action with plans to expand opportunity, to improve health, to raise living standards, to build houses. The benefits can be substantial. The reality is that increased investment in clean technologies, improved energy efficiency and strategic reinvestment of carbon revenues needs to be at the centre of our economic policy development and planning. Yet here we are with this interim budget taking our foot off the electric pedal, Mr. President. And again, Mr. President, a proportion of that hypothetical 3% of additional revenue could make a considerable difference to reprioritising the state's investment in positioning us as leaders in the climate change research, preparedness and climate justice spaces. Mr. President, another key measure by which we should assess the state budget is what they tell us about the government of the day's what they tell us about the government of the day's approach to maintaining or even strengthening our democratic integrity and oversight mechanisms. And well, these interim budget papers tell us a lot, Mr. President. A grudging will do that at least necessary, will do the least necessary approach is very evident in these budget papers. A grudging, minimal approach. The Ombudsman, the role of many hats in this state, receives a minor but welcome operational line item boost for 25-26, but this is quickly eroded over the forward estimates, which projects that vital oversight organ receives less than it's currently struggling to survive upon. The Tasmanian NPM, our OPCAT obligation, despite having significant statutory responsibilities under the OPCAT laws, the National Preventative Mechanism has provided a measly financial boost for the 25-26 year and the same for the 26-27 forward estimates, after which that particular funding drops off a cliff. Surprise, surprise, Mr. President, we sing the same song again, despite it providing to government a detailed implementation plan identifying its operational needs in order to comply with its statutory obligations. That does not seem evident in this budget, Mr. President. The Integrity Commission, another independent oversight entity which has resorted to stating publicly its underfunding is impacting upon its capacity to fulfil its obligations and do its job. Another minor boost for the 2025-26 year, but the forward estimate projections have it receiving less than it does currently. The Audit Office, Mr. President, an integral public probity office, I think most people would occur. An office, might I say today, actually, Mr. President, that delivers more than just opinions. More than just opinions. This is our statutory entity set up to do expert assessments and audits of our financial situations, of our government entities and GBEs, etc. This is not an office that is just any Joe Blow out in the street offering an opinion, Mr President, and it should never be dismissed as such. A Member of Parliament, whoever that Member of Parliament may be, should not be dismissive of a statutory entity like our Audit Office and the information provided by the audits that it does of our organs of government, our GBEs and our state-owned companies. To dismiss a very serious finding of our Audit Office is actually, I think, Mr President, unparliamentary. But back to the Audit Office in the budget, Mr President. A small office it is, which routinely punches above its weight with professional advice and public financial accountability outputs. Yet again, it is to experience a decrease in funding immediately after this interim budget, followed by further cuts over the forward estimates. At a time when there are growing calls for greater, clearer and more robust financial and probity scrutiny, a premier independent entity's funding is being continually curtailed, it would seem. This deliberate policy implementation tells us a lot about the government's priorities and attitudes to scrutiny. While this government likes to claim that it is the most transparent and accountable government ever, which sounds quite like Monty Python to me, Mr President, it certainly does not intend to have properly functioning independent entities if we go by what is in this budget. RTI reforms, moving on to other important scrutiny and transparency measures. Of further concern is the lack of provision that I could see, certainly, for the implementation of the significant recent Getting Back on Track independent review of Tasmania's Right to Information framework undertaken by Professor Tim McCormack and Adjunct Associate Professor Rick Snell. I don't see that in this budget, Mr President. We've done this sterling work, but there's two august professionals and we don't seem to be intending to fund the implementation of its recommendations, yet to be interrogated in estimates. The Woolcott Review, Mr President. We know that there are a range of recommendations forthcoming from the independent Woolcott Review, some of which will have budget implications, such as, for example, its strategic recommendation 5.4 that a new Commissioner of the State Service be established. Yet in the interim budget papers, there appears to be silence on any forward planning or provision to act on these significant recommendations coming out of the Woolcott Review. Mr President, before I move on, I do want to point out that these policy decisions to keep our integrity and oversight entities chained to a bare minimum financial drip feed does have enormous fiscal ramifications. As Budget Paper Volume 1 states, I quote, "The scope of the state's abuse-related liability may also be affected by the establishment or expansion of redress schemes, adding further uncertainty to long-term fiscal impact and reinforcing the need for ongoing actuarial review and monitoring." End of quote. So basically, Mr President, if the state finds itself in a position of having to take responsibility for wrongdoing which occurred on its watch, there is an economic and fiscal cost to that, to our state, down the track. And prevention, as we all know, Mr President, is better than cure. Fund our oversight entities so they can undertake their mandated statutory duties effectively and without fear or favour, and they will assist in reducing the need for future redress schemes, which will ultimately help the state's bottom line, and also, might I add, Mr President, help avert trauma and harm to Tasmanians. Mr President, I've publicly called out the regressive step taken by this interim budget in the omission of a gender budget impact statement. I hope this mistake is an aberration, Mr President, I really do. Ever since this chamber voted in support of an earlier motion of mine on the 8th of March 2022 calling for an annual gender budget impact statement as part of the state budget papers, such a document has been included. However, I do need to note I was highly critical of the first attempt, but I have acknowledged in each subsequent year the improvements that have been made since. We were genuinely improving that every single year, and yet here we see an interim budget with no gender budget impact statement. Why is that? There's no explanation provided, and it, I think, is a portent to potentially having this measure jettisoned in future budgets. There hasn't even been a commitment expressed, when this has been pointed out to the government, a commitment expressed to make sure that there will be one in next May's budget. Put simply, Mr President, gender budget impact statements are recognised by other jurisdictions and economic institutions such as the OECD as crucial economic and social policy tools. The tool recognises that every policy initiative in the budget has the potential to impact men, women, non-binary and gender diverse people differently, even if the policy is designed to be gender neutral. It further recognises these unintended consequences can mean a policy may result in inadvertently worsening the known gender gaps and other policy efforts that other policy efforts are striving to close. For example, the failure to prioritise safe and accessible public transport or housing or education or training impacts different genders differently. The failure to include a gender budget impact statement has been noted by other stakeholders. Shelter Tasmania's budget response on Friday the 7th of November included an observation about their disappointment that there was no gender budget impact statement. They pointed to the fact that, and I'll quote, "It provides an important analysis as we seek to address the need for housing support for women facing homelessness." Mr President, this policy equity tool is not an optional extra. The gender budget impact statement should be hard-baked into the fiscal and budgetary process. And as stated by the Queensland Council of Social Service report on this matter, I quote, "Gender-responsive budgeting involves analysing all policy measures to identify the ways in which the policy can either advantage or potentially disadvantage different cohorts of the Queensland population on the basis of gender. These gender-based differences arise not necessarily by intent, but because of different industries, different occupations and different roles in the household, organisations and wider community that men and women tend to take throughout their life path." End of quote. It's a really good little encapsulation from Queensland Council of Social Service there about why we look at gender-responsive budgeting and things like an analysis of a budget from a gender lens. A gender lens examination provided via that gender budget impact statement can help render the too often invisible ramifications of policy priorities visible, so we can actively consider them and interrogate them. This non-discretionary equity-focused tool is even more critical when we know the government's main attempt to balance the books, looking ahead, is to rely on cutting the public sector. Of those earmarked 2,800 jobs to go, Mr President, what is the gender distribution going to be, I wonder? Has anyone in government asked the following policy impact questions and sought to answer them on an evidence-based data, insights and analysis? For example, Mr President, who's likely to benefit most from the policy? Who is at most risk of being disadvantaged or overlooked by a policy? How do particular cohorts of women stand to benefit from or potentially be disadvantaged by this policy? And ultimately, is the policy contributing towards closing gender gaps in the short, immediate or long term? And it's not just the employment positions which should be scrutinised under a gender lens, it's also the impact those job cuts will have on service provision, on economic security, social inclusion and wellbeing, for example. I have to assume, Mr President, in the absence of any indication otherwise, that no gender lens was used to scrutinise the policy deliverables of the interim budget before us. I'm calling on the government to address this unacceptable omission as part of the formal response to the Appropriation Bills debate. Specifically, I'm urging the government to provide a reassurance that this omission was a mistaken oversight and to commit to continuing its automatic inclusion in future state budgets. Mr President, to conclude, the Treasurer claims the interim budget is one that, and I quote, avoids shockwaves. That may be true, Mr President, but all that guarantees is future tsunamis. This government's willful refusal to seriously engage in budget repair strategies now is a setup for dire ideologically driven cuts in the future. In fact, in the not too distant future, with the May 26-27 state budget looming. However, as I've noted during my contribution, there are steps this parliament can take to not only keep the pressure on for meaningful and equitable fiscal structural reform, but also to overhaul and modernise, where appropriate, our budgetary scrutiny and oversight mechanisms. I draw the Chamber's attention once more to a statement made by the Treasurer on last Friday's ABC Morning's radio program, and I quote, he said this, "And so with budget repair, and that's their language, I would say budget improvement, but whatever our language is, the time for political rhetoric is over. The time for action is now." End of quote. Mr President, exactly. I agree with the Treasurer. The time for action is now. When it comes to budget repair, and I do consider that language to be the factual description of the challenge before us, I couldn't agree more that the time for political rhetoric is over. The time for action is most definitely now, but the question remains, what action? And most pertinently, will this to date fiscally irresponsible Rockcliffe Liberal government have both the intestinal fortitude and the intellect to take the required action? As I note the deeply concerning interim state budget 2025-26, I also reiterate the need for this parliament to seize the opportunity presented by the next 5 months window before the May budget to consider how its scrutiny mechanisms can be strengthened and or extended. Mr President, the call to action applies to all of us. I note the budget.